Bible. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 3 this morning. So, we're going through this series called Still Called. We're looking at 8 different biblical characters that God used later on in their life to do, amazing things. So some people, they burn out early in life. They try to do too much too quick. Moses, he burned out at about the age of 40, right? So he was raised in Pharaoh's palace. So he was highly educated. He was a very important, very powerful man until one day he let his temper get the best of him and he committed murder, right? So then he runs for his life and you really don't see anything else of him for about another 40 years. So 40 years is a long time, right? It's enough time for us to have children, possibly even grandchildren. And it's this 40 years that God uses Moses to get him to the place where he needs to be, right? So it's the end of those 40 quiet years where Moses is in the desert. He's a shepherd, so he just goes out and goes to work every day, watches the sheep, leads them back and forth to the pasture, to water, protects them, all of these different things. So at the end of that 40 years, Moses still isn't done, right? He's 80 years old when God calls him to service. Right, so he's not a young man, is what we consider anymore. He's older, he's worn down. He thinks the life that he had before is behind him, and he's just content watching somebody else's sheep. They're not even his own, right? They're his father-in-law's sheep. So he's relying on the provision of his father-in-law, and he's just going about his day on and day after day, right? So he had failed in his life before. But if you've ever felt that way, like maybe something that you did in the past or a decision that you made or a direction that you took in your life and you felt like, well, that was a terrible decision and now I'm just stuck with it, right? That's just the way it's going to be. That's probably how Moses felt. And so Moses has got something for us to learn if that's where you are in your life. We're going to start, as I mentioned, in Exodus chapter 3. And I'm just going to read through the text, and then we'll start talking about Moses. So we're going to read verse 1 first. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Okay, so let's look at what Moses' life looked like. Okay, so we all know the story of Moses. He was put in the basket because the Pharaoh was killing all the young Hebrew children. He was sent in the Nile River, and Pharaoh's daughter found him, right? Well, his sister was keeping watch, seeing where the basket went, what happened, and when she saw who found Moses, she said, well, I'll go get somebody to help you with the baby, right? I'll go get you a nanny. Well, the nanny she goes and gets is his own mother. So she still gets to raise her son, even though Pharaoh's daughter had took her in. So he grew up in the palace. He grew up in wealth, right? So he's living in the most powerful household in the nation of Egypt, right? And in this time, and even when Moses goes back 80 years later and goes to help get the children of Israel out, Egypt is a very powerful nation, right? So the Pharaoh is a very powerful person. So Moses spent his early life up to the age of 40 living he didn't want for anything, right? He got the best education. He got the best of everything. He was in a prominent, powerful position. And unfortunately, no, he doesn't look like Charlton Heston, right? Every time I read this story, that tells you how many times I've seen the old movie, that old movie with Charlton Heston who played Moses, right? When I read it, that's the picture that I see in my head. But we see that he spent this time in the palace and for 40 years. Now, then these aren't going to be wasted years, and I'll touch on this later as we get into this, but he'd grown up with the best resources in Egypt, right? All of these great, wonderful things, and now here he is, he's in the desert. He's living as a shepherd, so it's not a bad life, but a very kind of humble, mundane, day-to-day, out in the heat. I'm sure it was a little hotter there than it is here. and he had long sleeves on. So Tina said that she's out on the heat and long sleeves this morning as we were coming to church. But you think about it. So now he's out in the desert, in the wilderness, and he's just a shepherd. He's a nobody. And then one day he is walking along with the sheep, and something significant happens. Okay, and this is where we're going to pick the story up, and I'm going to read from verse 2 all the way to, I think I have verse 12 is the last verse we're going to look at. So Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 2. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Okay, so just another ordinary day. Moses is out tending the sheep, and he sees something on the mountain, right? So obviously, in the desert, in the wilderness like this, fire would have been something that would have stood out. So he sees it, and he's like, wait a minute, and he's looking at it, and something's different, right? The bush is on fire, but it's not burning up. It's not being consumed by the fire. So he says, that's kind of strange. Let me go take a look at this, right? So this is where we're at, is one of the most direct calls that you're going to see in Scripture of God, right? Sometimes he's not as clear. He just, like with Abraham, we talked about Abraham and Sarah, right? What did he say? He says, pack your stuff and leave, and I'll show you where you're going to go. Moses, he's very specific in what he wants him to do, right? You're going to go get my children and free them from the enslavement that they are being that they're a part of in Egypt, right? So he goes to see and look at this bush, and it's not burning. And God speaks to him out of the bush, and he gives him directions. He gives him his plan. This is what I want you to do. This is what's coming next. This is what's going to happen. So now one of the things that I want to point out here is that this is what theologians call a Christophany. The person talking to Moses, the text, it says the angel of the Lord, and you'll notice that it's all caps. And then you'll see that it changes to the first person. God talked to him out of that bush, right? That's Christ. This is what a Christophany is. It's an appearance of Jesus before his earthly time, before his time on earth, right? So it's actually our Lord Jesus Christ who's speaking to Moses, because remember, Jesus is God. So he tells him, this is what I want you to do. Now, you got to think about it. Moses isn't thinking, well, man, I know the Pharaoh. We used to hang out, right? No, you got to remember, he spent 40 years in the desert. He spent 40 years away from Egypt. So it's not the same Pharaoh that he was raised with. So it wouldn't be like his grandpa. This is going to be somebody new. He probably knew who it was. And when you look, you got to look outside of Scripture sometimes to get a little more of the context. During this time, Pharaoh was one of the most evil people on earth, right? He was a terrible person. He did terrible things, not only to the Israelites, but the other nations around them that they conquered and that they would take over. So we got to keep all of this stuff in mind as you look at this story. But he tells Moses, I want you to go and get my people. Okay, and keep Moses' age in mind, right? He's 80 years old. And he's telling him, you're going to go do this. Well, what is Moses' response, which I didn't put it on there? He's like, I can't do that. That's not my thing. Who am I to go stand in front of Pharaoh and demand that he let your children go? Who am I to go talk to anybody? Because he also tells him that, I can't speak that well. And I can't do this, I can't do that, right? He's got this laundry list of excuses. Now, how many of you would have argued as well, right? I think every one of us would have been like, no. I mean, God, that's not my thing. That's not what I'm good at. That's not where I need to be, right? So how many of you have ever done that in yourself with something that God has called you to do? No, I don't want to do that. It's not the direction that you need me to go. I think I need to go another direction, right? Well, and I think if we're honest with ourselves, we all have at one point. And I know I have. And if I would not have given in to that, I wouldn't be standing up here this morning. I'd be sitting out there listening to somebody else. Because for a long time, I told God, that's not my thing. Nope, not me. We have that argument that we're not good enough. I can't do this, right? Moses, I can't talk well. I can't speak. I'm nobody. I'm just a shepherd. Who am I to go stand in front of Pharaoh and demand he release the Israelites? But what God told him at the end of verse 12, that's the key. And that's the thing that we need to grasp onto when God calls us to something. He said, I will be with you. So Moses is remembering all of this stuff that he had done in the past, right? And then he spent 40 years just being a normal, everyday Joe, doing what he did every day. Get up every morning. He would start his day off with leading the sheep out, sleep with the sheep, spend time with the sheep. And God says, you're going to do this great thing for me. And what God doesn't do, God doesn't say, yeah, I know you're not good at that. You're not good at this. He doesn't deny anything. He just says, but I will be with you. Moses' qualification was never about Moses. It was about him being obedient to God's call. Because God was going to take care of everything. God was going to give Moses everything that he needed. It was going to be God's power, not Moses's. And that's where we have a hard time, because as it's our human nature that when God calls us to something, or we get an idea that we want to do something, we want to do it. We don't want help. We want to do this. We don't want to do that. I can do it on my own, right? You think of children, right? How many of you, your kids or your grandkids, when they were little, right? I can do that. I don't need mom or dad's help, right? I'm still like that. I don't need help. I can do it. And then the next day I can't hardly walk because I did it by myself. We try to do things on our own, and we forget that God is the one that is with us. Scripture tells us that God is with us every single day, right? So when God does call us to something in our life, it doesn't matter how hard we think it is. It may be impossible for us to accomplish. What God called Moses to do was impossible for Moses to do on his own. And that's the point. Because God is the one that performed all of the miracles, right? The 10 plagues. Moses didn't do that. God did that. Moses didn't part the Red Sea. God did that, right? He just used Moses as a tool. And that's all we are. It sounds kind of bad to say that, but that's what we are. We're God's instruments that He uses to accomplish His things here on earth. He uses us to spread His gospel message. He uses us to show the world the love of Christ through us. So we've got to put the pride behind us and put ourselves behind us and allow God to work in and through us. And say, okay, God, it's not me, it's you. And put our faith and trust in Him and not come up with this long line of excuses of why we can't or how come I can't. But to remember that just like He told Moses, I will be with you. He has promised to be with us day in and day out. So we need to trust in that and allow Him to work in and through us. So Exodus chapter 7, verse 7. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Okay, so God tells Moses, okay, you're not that great of a speaker. I'm going to give you a little extra help. So he sends Aaron with him, right? He doesn't send him on his own. He gives him a helper. He gives him the speaker that he needs. So Moses was 80 years old and Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. 80 years old, standing in the throne room of the most powerful man in the known world and telling him what he's going to do. You don't think Moses was a little nervous. You don't think Aaron was a little nervous. But God was with them, right? So when you think about his age, if Moses had died at 75, at 78, or even, 79, we may or may not even have remembered who he was. Or we may have remembered him as somebody who had failed as the prince of Egypt, right? And had to run for his life and wound up herding sheep. So instead, the most important thing that we remember about Moses' life starts when he's 80 years old. It doesn't start with his time in Egypt. Now we have that included in the text so we know where Moses comes from. And like I said, when you think about where Moses grew up, okay, in this prominent, powerful position, what did he see day in and day out? He saw a nation being ran, right? He watched Pharaoh rule the nation of Egypt. So what does Moses do when he finally gets the children of God out from the slavery of Egypt? He's in charge of an entire nation. Do you think that played a little bit of a role in God getting him ready for what he had him to do? He knew how things had to be done. He had seen a large nation be run and how that worked. So God uses things in our life that we think may be wasted time, and he uses those to prepare us for what he has coming for us in the future. Because we remember when Moses gets the nation of Israel out of Egypt, and I have a bad tendency of doing this myself, and I have to really think about it. When you read that, and you think about them coming out of the land of Egypt, and you're like, okay, yeah, here's Moses and 20 people, right? He's got like 3 families and a few goats with him. No, it's a nation, right? They estimate the population of the nation of Israel to be a little over 100,000 people at the time. So when Moses gets this group of people, it's not like it'd be like us, loading up on a bus and going somewhere. It's a big deal. So he had seen this as he's growing up in the house of Pharaoh. So God used what he had done, what Moses had done in the past, the life that he'd had in the past, to prepare him for what he had called him to in the future. But here he is at 80 years old, and he's doing this amazing thing for God. So God, he didn't just use Moses despite what he had done in his past. He used that plus his time in the wilderness, tending sheep. You think he learned to be a little more patient? Because remember, that's what happened when he murdered that Egyptian. He lost his temper, right? He got angry and flew off the handle. So do you think 40 years tending sheep? Because, and again, I don't know hardly anything about sheep, so I had to do some research. They're not the easiest animals to take care of. They'll do anything they can do to get themselves in trouble. So God uses this time that Moses probably thought was wasted. He uses this time to prepare him for what he's going to call him to do. And he doesn't do it when he's 20. He doesn't do it when he's 30. He doesn't do it when he's 40. He waits till he's 80. God's going to use him despite of his insecurities and despite of his past. Because remember, anything that's happened in your past, God can redeem it for his good. It doesn't matter what it is. So I have an illustration, a little story. So a story about a man, we're going to call him Bill. So Bill spent his younger years chasing his career, and then his career fell apart in about his 40s, roughly the same age as Moses. He had a business that had failed that cost him nearly everything he owned, including some relationships, and he never fully recovered. He never fully repaired those relationships, restored those relationships. And for years afterwards, Bill quietly assumed his best contribution to the world was over. He worked a simple job, and he kept mostly to himself and figured that God had moved on to other people, and there was nothing that he had to offer. At the age of 71, a couple in his neighborhood lost their teenage son suddenly. And nobody expected Bill, of all people, to be the one who showed up every single day for that grieving family. Sitting with the father in silence, mowing the lawn without being asked, simply being present in a way that took no special skill except decades of having learned the hard way what real loss feels like. The father said years later that Bill's presence during these months did more for his faith than any sermon ever had. Bill's failure in his 40s turned out to be exactly what made him useful to that family in his 70s. He just couldn't see it until it was needed. So you think about Moses' younger years, he spent his early life in the palace watching and learning how a nation was run. And then later on in his life would help lead God's nation. So no matter what has happened in your past, no matter what failures you may see, God uses those things in our past to help shape us and to help mold us into the person that He needs us to be. And we have to remember again that God's timing is perfect. We always think, and I struggle with this and think, man, if I'd have done this 10 years ago, how much more impact could we have? If I'd have done this 20 years ago, how much better would this be? But we can't do that. We can't second guess God's timing because God's timing is perfect. We have to remember, too, that God is the potter and we're the clay. And He shapes us and molds us into the people that He calls us to be. Because remember, He doesn't call the equipped, He equips the called. He gives us everything that we need to do what He calls us to do, no matter what it is. No matter how big or how small, right? The things that we're looking at and all these people that we're talking about through this series, they're big, huge accomplishments, right? God shapes us for the small things too, not just the big things. God uses His people for the little things as well as the big things. But we always look for that. We always think about, man, we want this great big whatever to happen, right? Well, that's not how God works all the time. Yes, He is quite capable of that, but that's not always how it is. Sometimes it's those small things like Kathy talked about this morning in her little devotion before we went to Sunday school. Just paying attention in those little things and being there for somebody in those little moments. Sometimes those little moments have a greater impact than that big moment. And sometimes we don't see that impact. And sometimes that's hard for us, right? Because we like to see things happen. We like to see when we're kind to somebody, we like to see how that turns out. When we plant that seed of the gospel message in somebody's heart, we will like to see that seed grow, right? We don't always get that. But we need to be faithful in those little things because if we're not faithful in the little, God's not going to give you something big. So for our younger people, so if you're younger, I want you to notice where Moses' whole story actually started. It was with a bad decision, right? He lost his temper, he committed murder, and then he had to run for his life. So he still had much of his life ahead of him, the younger Moses did. But his failure, it didn't happen when he was older, it happened when he was younger, when he was impetuous, when he was impatient. And y'all know me, I got like this much patience. If it hadn't happened when he had, it happened when he had the energy, the anxiety, the ambition, the confidence in his own strength. Because that's what he was doing. He got mad, well, I'm going to take care of this, right? And it went south. And that's what happens for us most of the time. When we think, okay, I'm going to take care of this, that's when we muck it up. And that's when things go bad. So the good news is that Moses' story, it didn't end there. So, and this is something that I want us to think about. So if you're younger and you're eager to do something significant for God, ask Him to teach you patience and humility now. We don't want to have to learn the hard lessons that Moses learned, right? That's why we have all of these things in Scripture, so we know what not to do. That's why it's important for us to allow God, no matter what age we are, to work in us and to work through us. Because God uses people no matter where we're at. You don't have to just be 80 like Moses, right? Look at Timothy. Timothy was a young man that Paul entrusted. Timothy ran a church. He did wonderful things. So God can use us no matter where we're at in our walk with Him. And that's the important thing that I want all of us to understand. It doesn't matter whatever season that you're in, we need to turn to God and allow Him to sharpen us and allow Him to change us and allow Him to guide us. So let this be a season, whatever it looks like, be where God shapes your character for your future calling, whatever it may be. And again, it doesn't have to be something big. It doesn't have to be you don't have to lead a nation out of slavery, right? You just have to be faithful to whatever God has called you to do. Okay, I have 3 points of application for us this morning. And I remember to put them on the slides today. The first one is the past. So if you're carrying an old failure or a season that feels wasted or years that never amounted to what you had hoped to, don't assume that they were empty, right? Because God used 40 quiet, unremarkable years to shape the very qualities that Moses needed for what God was going to call him to do. Our wilderness seasons might not be a detour from our calling. It might be the preparation for it. Some of the hard things that we have to go through in our personal lives are what God uses to shape us. Some of the hard things that we go through in our personal lives are what God uses for us to help somebody else down the road. That, hey, look, I've been through that. I know what you're going through. And when you look around and you look at the church, so as a body of believers, what we are supposed to do is be there for each other, not only just in the good times, but in the bad times. There's somebody that you know that follows and loves Christ who has been through what you're going through. We just need to reach out. And if we are that person that has gone through it, we need to be open and we need to be honest with those people. We need to be willing to reach out and help those people work through whatever it is. Because God uses those times to get us ready so that we can come alongside somebody else and help them through that difficult situation or that difficult time. So He uses our past. Because remember, God is a redeemer, right? He redeems us and He redeems everything in our past, that He can use it for the good, right? The second thing is disqualified. Don't let your list of disqualifications talk you out of following God's direction for your life. Because that's what Moses tried to do, and that's what we do. Moses had plenty of good reasons why he wasn't the man for the job, right? God didn't argue with him and say, well, no, that's not right. You're good. You're okay here. You're good there. He just said, I will be with you. So don't let your own list of disqualifications talk you out of that. So if you're older and you feel unqualified for whatever God is nudging you toward, remember that the qualification was never supposed to come from you in the first place. And if you're younger, the same is true. If you feel like God is calling you to something and you think, well, I can't do that, I'm not old enough, I haven't been a believer long enough, it doesn't matter. Because it's not you that accomplishes it, it's God. So don't disqualify yourself. Because remember, and I say this all the time, and I'm going to keep saying it, God will drag you kicking and screaming out of your comfort zone and put you where He needs you, not where you want to be, where He needs you. The third thing is open eyes and an open heart. Keep your eyes open for that burning bush moment, right? God might still have something for you that you weren't looking for. So be open to those things. Be paying attention. So look at Moses. Moses it was another day at work, right? He's out watching the sheep. Something catches his eye. So just because your days feel routine doesn't mean that God has stopped planning something significant for you. And again, when we talk about something significant for you in your life, it doesn't necessarily have to be you're rescuing a nation. It can just simply being there for somebody. Simply being that person that somebody can rely on, that somebody can lean on. Sharing the love of Christ with somebody who doesn't know what that looks like. Sharing the gospel message with somebody who hasn't heard it or doesn't understand it. God doesn't quit just because you think that your life has been wasted or that time has been wasted, right? Or because you're just going through the motions day in and day out. Well, I just go to work, I do this, I go home, I go to church on Sunday. Just because it feels insignificant doesn't mean that God is not using that to prepare you for what He is calling you to do. So as we come to a close this morning, 80 years old, standing in front of Pharaoh with 40 wasted years that he thought were wasted behind him, and God still had the most important assignment for Moses' life waiting for him, right? That 40 years wasn't an end of Moses' usefulness. They were the quiet preparation for it. So if you're wondering whether your own wilderness years or your doubts or your failures, your long seasons of feeling ordinary have used you up, let Moses answer for you. God wasn't finished with that 80-year-old shepherd, was He? He had plans. He isn't finished with you either. So God's not finished with His people just because of failure, obscurity, or age. That's not how God works. He often uses those very years to prepare us for what He has called us to. So I was listening to Josh Howerton. He's a pastor at a church in Dallas here a couple months back. And as I was getting ready for this, something he said, it clicked, and I've heard him say it a couple other times. He said, there's only two things that have expiration dates. It's canned goods and Tylenol. He said, if you try to find your expiration date, it's not stamped on you anywhere because we don't have one. God's children don't have an expiration date. It doesn't matter. God can use us as long as we allow Him to use us, right? We have to be paying attention, looking for what He's calling us to do, and to be open to His guidance and His calling. And remember that it's Him, it's not us, because that's where we mess up. I can't do that, God. No, you can't, but God can. Remember, God can do anything. He created the world that we live in with His words. He breathed life into Adam. We can't do any of that. I mean, we can try and create things, right? We grow gardens, we tend it. We don't create it. God created all that. All we do is kind of tend it, right? Paul said in 1 Corinthians that he planted, Apollos watered, but God gives the growth. And that's very true for everything. You look around our world, everything in our world, we can plant it, we can water it, but we can't make it grow. God's the one that does that. And it's the same in our spiritual lives. When we're planting the seeds that God has given us to plant, we're faithful to just plant that seed. And then we water it by spending time with those people and sharing the gospel with those people. But we can't make that grow. Only God can do that. So don't ever forget that it's God that does the work in and through us. So no matter where you're at in your life, and no matter how unqualified you think you may be, when you put your faith and trust in God and you surrender to that wholeheartedly, God will take care of that. He takes care of the details. He takes care of the hard things. And that's when the world sees what Christ looks like. When they can see and understand that it's not us doing it, that it's God doing that through us. That's how we shine that light that we're called to shine. Is when they look at us, they don't see us. They see Jesus, right? They see how He would love, how He would live, how He would act. And that's one of the greatest testimonies we can ever give. So as we have our time of invitation, that's the question I want us all to ask ourselves. What has God been preparing you for over these last several years? 5 years, 10 years, 2 years, 6 months? What is God getting us ready for? And are we willing to surrender to that and allow Him to accomplish His will through our life? And if we've been avoiding that, today's the day to let that happen. To tell God, God, here I am. What did Moses say? Here I am, right? So we need to be open and willing, saying the same thing. God, here I am. Use me. And if you don't have that relationship with Jesus Christ yet, today's the day to start. Scripture says today is the day of salvation. Don't put off tomorrow, right? Because we know we're not promised tomorrow. Allow God to work in and through us.